Hello and welcome to Breaking Down History. My name is Mr. Pritchard.
And I'm Dr. Dickens.
And today we're going to be answering the question, is it really possible to resist a dictatorship? So, last time we looked at dictatorships. What did we find out about them? What were they?
Well, we found out that in modern dictatorships you usually have one strong ruler. There are very few freedoms that people living in dictatorships have. And there's no real system of democracy where people can vote for their own government in free and fair elections. Dictators try to control their populations with ways including fear and terror.
So things like the secret police.
Exactly.
Right, so we're looking at resistance this time. What is resistance? What does that look like?
Well, resistance really means that people are refusing to follow the rules. Now, we actually see resistance in all sorts of different aspects of our own lives. I like to think of resistance in school. Now, actually, we see students from time to time refusing to follow school rules, and that's a form of resistance. So I wonder, what sort of forms of resistance do we see in schools?
Resisting taking earphones out, resisting putting on the right shoes. Those are the main ones I see.
I like one of the forms of resistance that I see quite a lot is students who tell you that they don't understand something, so that they don't have to do the work. It's like, oh, sir, I don't get it. And we've probably always been there. We've been there ourselves when we were school students. You think, oh, I'm not so keen in answering that question. I'll just say that I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
And that's almost a form of resistance too.
Okay, so what does this resistance have to do with dictatorships?
Good question. Now, we might imagine that in dictatorships, resistance is pretty much impossible, because remember, dictators try to control their populations as closely as possible. But actually, although it's difficult to resist and refuse to follow rules in dictatorships, it is possible. People do resist, although resistance is often limited, which means that there's often not very many opportunities to resist. Now, we're going to work out how far people resisted in two dictatorships in the 1930s. One's going to be Nazi Germany, and one's going to be the USSR, or Soviet Union, under Stalin. We're going to have a look at how people resisted, how the government responded to resistance, and how successful resistance actually was.
Okay, so hopefully we'll be by the end we'll be able to answer that question that we often get asked by students, which is, why didn't people fight back? Why didn't people fight against these sort of dictatorships? How would you like people to be taking notes for today?
Well, as you're listening to the podcast, I would recommend that you get a blank piece of paper or a page in your exercise book, and you split that page or piece of paper into two columns. The top of one column, write Nazi Germany. At the top of the other column, write Stalin's Soviet Union or USSR, and you can fill each column with details about resistance in each country.
Okay, so the first dictatorship we're looking at is that which existed in Nazi Germany, something that most Year 9s will have studied. Why is religion really important when we look at Nazi Germany?
Well, we need to understand that when the Nazis came to power, and that was in 1933, most Germans were religious, and most Germans belonged to a certain branch of Christianity. About 2/3 of Germans were Protestants, and about 1/3 of Germans were Catholics. And they're two different types of Christianity. Now, the Nazis were actually quite concerned about this, because they thought that if people followed these religions, then they might be less likely to follow the Nazis' ideas. And so the Nazi Party tried to control religion. For example, it set up a new Protestant church called the Protestant Reich Church, and it made an agreement with the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church in Rome, called the Concordat, which meant that the Nazis wouldn't stop people from worshipping the Catholic faith, provided that Catholics didn't try and resist the Nazis.
So the Nazis are trying to control the church, because I guess for most people who are religious, religion is the most important thing in their lives, so they're trying to get a hold of that.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Right, so did Germans resist this religious change, these religious policies?
Well, first of all, we need to say that not all Germans resisted. And in fact, quite a few religious Germans, in particular quite a few Protestants, were actually quite strong supporters of the Nazis. And that's very important. But there were some religious people who chose to resist the Nazis' religious policies. Let me give you a couple of examples. One is a Protestant pastor called Martin Niemöller. Now, in the Protestant church, this is a bit like a priest. Now, Martin Niemöller set up a separate confessing church, which was separate from the Nazis' Reich Church, and it challenged Nazi religious policies and some of the Nazis' political ideas as well. Now, this confessing church was actually quite popular. At a certain point, it had 6,000 pastors, the equivalent of priests in the Protestant church, 6,000 pastors who joined it.
And these people would have been speaking out against the Nazis, I guess.
Some of them would, yeah.
Right. So the Protestant pastors set up their own church. What did Catholics do?
Well, some Catholic priests, just like some Protestant pastors, chose to speak out against Nazi policies as well. And one very famous example was a man called Cardinal Galen from the city of Münster. Now, Galen spoke out against the Nazis, and in particular, he was very concerned that the Nazis were murdering disabled people. Now, this was one of the most unpleasant aspects of the Nazi dictatorship. They went after people with physical and mental disabilities, and they murdered them. And Galen stood up and he said, no, this has got to stop.
Okay, so you've got people in both religions that are protesting and resisting the Nazis.
Yes.
How do the Nazis actually respond to this?
They're extremely unhappy about this. And we need to remember that the Nazis, even right at the beginning when they came to power, were already quite worried that people who were religious might resist them. So they're very unhappy that you've got both Catholics and Protestants who are resisting them. They saw it as a sign of themselves being challenged. Now, around 800 members of the Protestant Confessing Church were arrested for speaking out against the Nazis, and these included that pastor, Martin Niemöller. And Martin Niemöller was actually sent to a concentration camp in 1937, where he stayed all the way until the end of the Second World War in 1945.
So why did they arrest them? Is it because what danger did they, I guess, give to the Nazis? Why were they arrested?
Well, I think really the Nazis were concerned that if these pastors stood up and spoke out against the Nazis, people might start to question whether or not they should be supporting the Nazi government in the way that they have been.
Right, so it's the influence they're going to have on the rest of
Exactly.
society. Okay, so what about the Catholics who resisted the Nazis? Were they arrested in the same way?
Well, it's really interesting. I talked about Cardinal Galen before. Now, Cardinal Galen himself was not actually arrested. And it's quite interesting. The Nazis feared that he was already too popular. And they thought that if they chose to arrest him, then many Catholics, especially Catholics in his home city of Münster, would be really, really unhappy with the Nazis and would start resisting the Nazis even more. So they didn't arrest Cardinal Galen. However, several of Galen's supporters were arrested. These included priests who distributed his sermons, so gave out copies of his speeches, and they were arrested and they were executed by the Nazis.
So because they couldn't get to Galen, he's too big,
Yeah.
they go after his supporters instead.
Exactly.
So were the churches the only people to resist the Nazis?
Not at all. There were other people who resisted the Nazis, including many young people.
So these young people, why did they want to resist the Nazis? We've got the churches, they disagree with the sort of killings that the Nazis...
Yeah.
Is it the same for young people?
Sometimes it is. Sometimes there are other reasons as well. Now, what we need to remember is that the Nazis were really, really interested in controlling young people. And they set up organisations for young people to join so that they could teach them Nazi ideology, Nazi political beliefs, and they could get them doing the sort of activities that the Nazis thought would make Germany stronger. Now, these organisations included the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. And these organisations were compulsory for young people by 1939. What that meant is that young people had to join them. Now, they were supposed to train young people to support the Nazis and to strengthen Germany. And if we take a look at posters of the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls, Nazi posters, these organisations seem actually quite fun, quite exciting.
So you can see the two posters that we've got on the screen, if you can see that they look really happy, don't they? They look like they're really enjoying these organisations.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
I'm guessing these organisations weren't all fun and games.
No, and in fact, we might think, let's look at those posters, we might think that this is a piece of propaganda that the Nazis are putting forward, and it absolutely is.
Well, just remind us really quickly, what is propaganda?
So that's information that is used to influence the way people think and to convince people of certain ideas. Now, you're absolutely right that these organisations weren't all fun and games. They weren't all exciting and happy. In fact, the Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls could be really quite brutal. The Hitler Youth in particular, which was the organisation for boys, was run like the military. There was harsh discipline and there was hard training. And the idea behind this is that the Nazis are wanting to prepare boys to go into the army and fight for Germany. And so these organisations, in particular the Hitler Youth, focused on physical and mental strength. So there were activities like sports, like hikes. Now they might sound quite fun. There were also activities like learning how to handle weapons and fight in battle, which some people might find fun. There were others that were completely unexciting and unfun altogether. So members might be dunked in ice cold water. There were beatings of Hitler Youth members to toughen them up.
So how did young people respond to these horrible measures that were going on?
Well, some young people chose to resist, and they did this sometimes by setting up their own organisations. Let's take a look at a couple of organisations. One is called the Swing Youth. Now, the Swing Youth were young people who listened to jazz and swing music from America, and they followed American fashion.
So, hang on, this is just listening to music. How is this resistance?
Well, it is resistance, actually, if you think about it, because these young people were refusing to accept the Nazis' ideas about what young people should do. So they were refusing to get involved in that military training. They were refusing to dress, for example, in the ways that the Nazis wanted them to dress. They were refusing to accept certain ideas that the Nazis had about politics and about race. So, for example, the music that the Swing Youth listened to, jazz music, that was music which had originated amongst African Americans. Now, according to the Nazis, white people in Germany shouldn't be listening to that sort of music at all, because they had these really strong racist ideas. So these young people in the Swing Youth were resisting ideas about race. They were also resisting ideas about gender, about what girls and boys should do. So, for example, in the Swing Youth, boys would often have long hair. And that wasn't something that the Nazis believed was appropriate for boys. So by having that long hair, that's a sign that they're not following the rules and they're resisting themselves.
So we've got the Swing Youth listening to music, growing their hair, basically getting involved in culture that was sort of forbidden.
Absolutely.
Were there any other ways young people resisted?
Yeah. So there's another organisation, really interesting organisation, called the Edelweiss Pirates. Now, the Edelweiss Pirates got their name from a flower, the Edelweiss flower, and they created metal pins of this flower and they wore them on their shirts to show that they were part of this organisation. Now, Edelweiss Pirates got involved in group activities like hikes and playing music, but they were also more aggressive than the Swing Youth. So they told dirty jokes about the Nazis and about Hitler, and they went out and sometimes physically attacked or assaulted members of the Hitler Youth.
So they're sort of like a gang?
Yeah, really, they are.
Okay, so if you were caught in one of these organisations, what would have happened to you?
It was actually quite dangerous. Many young people were arrested, and later on, especially during the Second World War, when the Nazis really tried to control society even more strongly, some young people were executed for being part of these organisations.
So we've looked at Nazi Germany. Let's look at the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
so modern Russia now. What was going on there in the 1930s?
Well, in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the country was being led by Joseph Stalin, who was a brutal dictator who controlled his population very closely, including by the secret police, which was known as the NKVD. Now, the interesting thing is that Stalin actually imagined that lots of people were resisting him. And he gave this as a reason to go out and arrest and execute people who he really didn't like and who he suspected might cause problems for him.
So there was a paranoia
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
Stalin. Did people actually resist him?
This is a really interesting question. Now, many historians used to say that there wasn't really any resistance under Stalin at all. More recently, though, some historians have started to look at the evidence again and say, well, actually, we can find examples of people resisting. And there's a couple of main areas that we can look at. One is work, which we're going to look at now, and we'll come to religion as well in a few minutes.
Okay, so workers, how did they resist Stalin and the government?
Well, what Stalin really wanted to do in the Soviet Union in the 1930s was modernise the country, make it stronger, make it more profitable, make its economy better. And so he introduced a series of what were called 5-year plans. These were plans to make the Soviet economy stronger and to modernise the Soviet Union. So there were 3 5-year plans starting in 1928, going through to 1941. And under these 5-year plans, workers were expected to work hard to really improve the Soviet economy. Now, in fact, lots of workers refused to work very hard for Stalin at all. Occasionally, some workers went out on strikes. Now, we do have examples of big strikes in 1932, when up to 20,000 workers in the Soviet Union refused to go to work, and they criticised the Soviet government, and they even attacked physically the managers of their factories.
Well, so this is a really big example of protest.
It is.
In a country where it's often been assumed there was no large-scale protests whatsoever.
Absolutely.
So what examples do we have?
So we've got the example of the strikes, but we've also got some quieter examples of resistance, people resisting in ways which weren't as obvious. And that's really important, because if you're trying to resist in a dictatorship, you're usually not going to want to draw too much attention to yourself, because it's very dangerous if that happens. You can easily be arrested. Now, what workers in the Soviet Union did to resist in a more quiet way was by wasting lots of time at work. So they would just find ways not to work very hard at all. Now, Soviet managers in factories complained that workers often spent lots of time just wandering around the factory, not doing very much work, not doing essentially what they were told. And we've got some really clear examples. The Soviet government sent out officials to look at what was happening in factories, because they were worried that many workers weren't working as hard as they should be. Now, one report in 1933 went to a Moscow factory, and the officials who went to that factory found that workers there were spending their time not working, but buying train tickets and theatre tickets. They were going to a cafe and snack bars in the factory rather than working, and they estimated that the actual working day, which should have been something like 10, 11, 12 hours, was probably about 5.5 hours. So workers were wasting somewhere like 50% of their time, not really doing any work at all. There was another report in 1937, which looked at another factory in Moscow, and this report said that in the corridor, workers traded books and sold ice cream to each other. Sometimes, the report said, it's a factory, and sometimes it's a department store.
That is my favourite type of resistance, I think, now. Ice cream-based resistance I can get on board with.
Yeah.
So were they refusing to work hard? Was this a big plot from the Russian workers?
Well, that's a really tricky question to answer. There's a couple of things that we need to bear in mind. First of all, people might have been working or not working hard because life was really difficult in the Soviet Union. There wasn't enough food around, so people were often hungry, and people weren't paid very much. So it may be that they weren't working because of that. And if that's the case, then we might say, well, it's not really resistance. The other thing we need to bear in mind is that the Soviet economy at this time and Soviet factories often didn't work very well anyway. So machinery often broke down. So workers sometimes couldn't really work very hard. But There were workers who clearly thought that they shouldn't be working as hard as the Soviet government wanted them to, and those workers who were wandering around the corridors buying ice cream and buying tickets for the theatre and buying books, clearly that's a type of resistance, because they're saying we're just not going to do what we're being told.
Okay, so was work the only way in which people resisted in the Soviet Union?
No. One other way that people resisted was religion. Now, we need to think about what the Soviet government thought about religion in the Soviet Union. Actually, the Soviets hated religion. People like Stalin, they didn't like religion at all. Now, in the Soviet Union, in Russia, the biggest religion was Orthodox Christianity. It's a slightly different type of Christianity to Protestantism and Catholicism, which we looked at in Germany. And the Orthodox Church, before the communists had come to power, actually supported the Tsar, so they supported the king. And communists believed that religion was a threat to them, so they didn't like they didn't like religion at all.
So if they didn't like religion, what did they do to try and control it?
Well, in the 1930s, the Soviet government started to attack the Orthodox Church to make sure that it didn't have much influence amongst Soviet people. So in the 1930s, over half of churches in the Soviet Union were closed down. One of the things that happened very often in these churches was that communists would come in, they would take down the church bells, and they would melt them down. And they could use that metal to build machinery for factories. But of course, if you're religious, that's going to be really insulting to you. They're taking down these really important parts of your churches. They're just turning them into machinery. Now, as well as that, the communists set up anti-Christian and anti-religious organisations. Now, we'd actually looked at one of these organisations last time round. It's the Communist Youth League, the Komsomol. And this organisation, one of the things that it did was that it encouraged people in the Soviet Union to turn away from religion, and it attacked religion.
So if the government, and this is a government that rules through fear and terror, is attacking religion, it must have been really difficult for people to still be religious.
Yes, it was, and many people actually became quite frightened about the idea of worshipping. But it still didn't stop people from worshipping. What happened was that people often stopped going to church, but they would worship religion in their own homes, often using hidden objects like crosses or religious icons, which were used in the Orthodox Church. A more common way was also by celebrating religious holidays. So Russian peasants in particular had lots and lots of religious holidays which they had celebrated before the communists had come to power. Now in the 1930s, in the Soviet Union, those peasants carried on celebrating those holidays. And what often happened was that they would refuse to do any work on those days at all. They would drink very heavily, they'd get into fights, and sometimes they would attack communists as well.
Okay, so were people still religious? How many people were religious at this point in time?
Well, it's slightly difficult to say for a couple of reasons. One is that people were sometimes afraid of saying that they were religious, so it's not always obvious that they were religious. However, in 1937, the Soviet government carried out the census, and that's where they go round and they work out how many people live in a country, what sort of jobs they do, and what sort of things they might believe in. So, for example, religion. And the 1937 census found that 57% of people in the Soviet Union still said they believed in a religion. Now, most of these said they were Orthodox Christians. Now, we need to remember that many people in the Soviet Union were still quite scared of saying that they were religious at all. So that figure of 57% of people saying they're religious, it might be even more than that, because some people might have just said we're not religious to keep themselves safe.
And that's pretty impressive considering all the things that the Soviet government had done to try and clamp down on religion.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so if we summarise everything we've learnt so far, is it really possible to resist a dictatorship?
Well, we've looked at the situation in Nazi Germany, and we've looked at the situation in Stalin's Soviet Union. What I'd like you to do at home now is take a look at that table with those two columns that you've drawn. Have a look. What similarities and differences can you see between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union? I'd like you please to pause your video now, look back over your notes and have a think. How's the situation in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union either similar or different? So, Mr. Pritchard, you've asked me loads and loads of questions over the course of this podcast. I want to flip this over and ask you a question now. What similarities and differences can you see in these two countries, these two dictatorships?
Well, let's start with the similarities. So I guess the key one is that in both countries you have resistance happening from religious people or from people in the churches themselves.
Yeah.
So that's a clear similarity. I guess some of that is to do with the fact that religion is a very important part of people's lives, so something they're willing to fight for, and then also the fact that religion teaches people about right and wrong and about sort of moral standards, and so people have a thing that they can sort of judge these dictatorships against.
Yeah.
And then I guess another similarity between these two things is that a lot of this resistance is happening in secret. It's not really mass organisations, not hundreds of thousands of people going out on marches. It's sort of quite passive in terms of the things they have in common.
Yeah, and we need to remember that many people chose to resist in secret because it was so dangerous to resist in dictatorships.
So the difference is, I guess you've got the type of people that are resisting again. So because there's such a focus on the youth in Germany, there are maybe more young people resisting there than there were in the USSR. And then at the same time, the actual ways of getting rid of resistance is more effective in the USSR. So they deal with people in a more thorough and maybe terrible way than happens in Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
I think that's fair, yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the last question I have is a sort of question that we've got to come back to. Is this resistance effective? Is it possible, to resist a dictatorship, and does it actually have an impact on countries like Germany and the Soviet Union?
This is such an interesting question because we've got all these examples of resistance in Nazi Germany and in the Soviet Union, but actually we could argue that these forms of resistance are not very effective at stopping a government from controlling a country. They're not very well organised, and it's far too dangerous for most people to try and openly attack the government. So lots of this resistance is quiet, it's small scale. So we could say that this doesn't have much of an impact. And in fact, we know that in the Soviet Union, Stalin carried on ruling the Soviet Union until 1953, when he died of natural causes. It wasn't resistance that stopped him. And the Nazis in Germany, they carried on ruling Germany until 1945, when they lost the Second World War. And again, it wasn't resistance that stopped them. So we could say resistance has no real impact. But the interesting thing is, if we look at what ordinary people are doing in these dictatorships, the fact that they're resisting suggests that people still had at least some freedoms. They had some freedoms to do the things that they wanted, even if these things didn't have a massive impact on how their governments actually worked. Okay, so we've looked at these different examples. We started off with that question, is it really possible to resist a dictatorship? You've got your table with those two columns. Underneath your table, we'd like you please to write up a short answer to that question. Based on what you've seen, is resistance really possible in a dictatorship?